Hello, folks. So welcome to New Frontiers, Rethinking the Western and Nostalgia. We've got 3 great papers for you and 4 speakers, because one of them is co-presented. Before we get going, so for the speakers, I'll let you know how much time you've got left using the chat tab. So if you could keep an eye on that, that would be great. I'll give sort of 10, 5, and 2-minute warnings. The only circumstance in which I'll verbally interrupt is if something's really going over. Okay, so otherwise it'll be in the chat tab. So please do keep an eye on that. For the audience, we'll keep questions for the end. If you could let me know if you want to ask a question in the chat tab, that would be great, because I've learned from experience of teaching that sometimes I can be a bit blind to the emojis popping up on people's screens. So if you could just let me know down in the chat tab if you want to ask a question. You can either ask the full question, I'll ask it for you, or you can just tell me that you want to ask a question and I'll hand over to you. Okay, so we have got Pawel Pyrka, who is an assistant professor at the SWPS University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw, where he teaches American literature and critical theory. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the golden age of American pulp fiction and has published articles on Poe, Lovecraft, and Grabinski. His research interests include popular literature and culture, memory studies, exchanges between technology and culture, and cooperative storytelling in role-playing games. We've also got Stefan Rabitsch, who is a postdoctoral researcher in American Studies at the University of Graz and a visiting lecturer at the University of Klagenfurt. A self-declared academic Trekkie, which is a great phrase, is the author of Star Trek and the British Age of Sail, co-editor of Set Phases to Teach, and co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook to Star Trek. He is also the co-author of American Culture Through Video Games. His second monograph, I Wear a Stetson Now, Stetsons Are Cool, A Cultural History of Western Hats, which sounds fascinating, received the 2019 Fulbright Visiting Scholar Grant in American Studies, and I will hand over to you, and I will let you know in the chat tab how time is going. All right.
Alrighty, thanks so much, Craig. Let's get the show on the road, shall we? Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Both Pawel and I would like to thank and congratulate the conference organizers for pulling off such an engaging virtual event during these ongoing pandemic times of ours. So our paper today draws on work in progress, as they say, because it's based on a chapter on CBS's Yellowstone New West scholarship that we co-author. It's been accepted for publication in a forthcoming essay collection titled Kevin Costner, America's Teacher. Now, we'd like to kick off by throwing you right into the world of Yellowstone. For those of you who are perhaps not familiar with it, it was conceived, created, and run by actor-turned-writer-director Taylor Sheridan. Yellowstone is essentially contemporary family political drama that weaves together many, if not most, issues that continue to plague the rural economies of the American West. The show centers on 6th-generation ranching patriarch John Dutton, played by Kevin Costner, trying to maintain his power base as the owner of the largest contiguous ranch in Montana. While this might sound a little bit like the television show Dallas, updated and rebooted for 21st century post-network television, according to Sheridan, the series actually owes more to The Godfather than Dallas. We'd like to share with you 2 short scenes from the latest season back-to-back, and these serve to basically give you a bit of a feel for the show, but also the 2 clips speak to the central through lines of our paper, which we'll then discuss in further detail.
That is the key component that undergirds these 2 clips, and indeed much of the show. The changing value, material and otherwise, attributed to the land, access to the land, and ownership and control of the land are major themes that inform the show. Consequently, it only makes sense that the main narrative side is a large family-owned cattle ranch. As geographer Paul Stars has argued in his 1998 Comparative Geographic History of Cattle Ranching in the West, Let the Cowboy Ride, quote, "Without land, ranching is nothing except labor, cows, grass, and a bit of borrowed fancy." Unquote. However, ranching interests and the goals of the local indigenous community to repatriate the land are but 2 stakeholders who are invested in or vie for control over the land in the show.
Now, while Yellowstone dabbles in familiar as in mythopoetic Western territories, it does so to speak to and comment on what we would tentatively label land-based complexities or ambiguities. Oscillating between social realism and neo-Western, we contend that Taylor Sheridan's work is indeed scholarly as much as it is artistic, in the sense that the series seems to build on the paradigm-shifting Atlas of the New West, and subsequently channels a little over 2 decades of New West scholarship, inaugurated by New Western historians such as Patty Limerick or Richard White, and translates that into a popular cultural format. In other words, the view from John Dutton's ranch is reminiscent of William Wakeup's 1998 article, View from Suburban Montana, which encompassed, quote, "the pros and cons of expanding populations, the limits and opportunities of a natural resource economy, the potential paths towards sustainable development, the vices and virtues of tourism in the West," unquote. Understanding the West as this locus of complexity and intersectionality, which of course includes whiteness and the greatly distorted and excessively remediated mythical West, is the result of New Western scholarship, which we argue Taylor Sheridan actually translates into a mass media format. So the New West in Yellowstone is then also reflective of a carefully braided New Western nostalgia that seeks to rehabilitate the image of livestock raising and horsemanship economies and their attendant cultural traditions, such as roughstock sports, in the vein of what a literary scholar, Nina Baum, has attributed already to the literatures of the New West. That is, there is, quote, a jaunty impertinence, simultaneously grandiose and defensive.
Yeah, let's quickly position and locate Yellowstone in a broader sociocultural and mass media context, where the show, of course, does not exist in a vacuum. It's a recent addition to what is best described as a resurgence or a renaissance of Western spaces, characters, tropes, and more, particularly on television in the last decade and a half. Arguably inaugurated by the quality TV hit show Deadwood in 2004, the Renaissance has since seen a variety of offerings and concepts, some longer lived than others. These include, but are not limited to, Hell on Wheels, Longmire, Vegas, Killer Women, Winona Earp, and coming up a little over weeks from now, the reboot of Walker, Texas Ranger. Painting in broad strokes now, it's not that surprising that this resurgence has taken place in the wake of the trauma incurred by 9/11 and the latent impact of the perpetual war on terror has had on the American psyche. Historically speaking, the American West has often served as an allegorical canvas and narrative safe space to process, work through, and or give voice to challenges faced by the national psyche. Also, let's not forget sociopolitical relevance of the West as a region. In a recent article in a Columbia Law Review, legal scholar Wilfred Codrington has re-emphasized an American truism has been periodically pushed to the sidelines of national public consciousness. Quote, as the Western states go, so goes the nation. End quote. It was the West that elected Donald Trump. It was also elected Barack Obama and George W. Bush. And the changing demographics in the region that have been tracking for quite some time finally registered on the electoral map in the election of Joe Biden.
So in order to see and understand what we think is this new Western nostalgia, it also helps to get our bearings on more traditional expressions of nostalgia and the common misperceptions about life in the region that they have tendered. Painting in broad strokes again, nostalgia in its basic sense, this longing for return to the home is the bedrock for many foundational myths and narratives in the US and their attendant discourses. The Western as a genre employed nostalgia in a similar fashion. It created this national neverland, freezing a particular sliver of the Western experience in time and also in space, at least early on, the quintessential topos were arid Western locales in the Southwest. And of course, we're talking about this historical period where the West, that is the frontier in the Turnerian sense of the word, was about to be closed. The genre Western then turned the West into a perpetual swan song for a certain narrowly defined dimension of cowboying life mixed in with epic adventures offered by frontier outlawry. And while we've seen the rise of, revisionist Westerns, post and also anti-Westerns, the latent presence of this nostalgia for and return to historical times and places that never truly were is indeed very pronounced. And again, drawing on Paul Starrs, he has argued that, quote, there's no place for ambiguity in the attitudes held by most Americans, not just Westerners, toward ranching. Its history, its culture, and its economics. It's either love or hate. The polemics notwithstanding, he has a point there in that people's polarized and also polarizing reactions speak to either regionally confined lived experiences and or outright ignorance of ranching history and culture, which is more often than not marred by simplistic images and associations generated by excessive ongoing myth-making. While there are Elegiac cowboy voices in Yellowstone, the nostalgia at work in the series is not so much about returning to an imagined past that never was. Rather, it is rooted in better understanding the complexities of this new West in the present without either falling for the latent influence exerted by the mythopoetic West and or outright dismissing livestock ranching and horsemanship economies as just another dimension of white culture where we can easily get away with critical, albeit usually also ignorant, derision. So we argue that also it's particularly the show's principal creator who provides us with a key to unlocking this new Western nostalgia.
Yeah, we think that it's not too outlandish to claim that Sheridan's oeuvre so far is at least in part educational and rehabilitative, indeed redemptive. He has repeatedly gone on record stating that him growing up on the ranch in Texas, where he still lives, being acculturated in a family with deep roots in livestock raising and horsemanship economies, has had tremendous impact on particularly his writing and directing. Initially, the show was supposed to be with HBO. Sheridan had written 2 scripts for them. A meeting he had with a senior vice president early in the development sort of illustrate what Paul Starrs intimated in his polemic. Sheridan was called in, and the senior exec told him that he would not move ahead with the project. When he asked why, the exec said something to the effect of, "Nobody wants to see this. Nobody wants to see a movie about this. And the audience, you don't understand why anybody's sitting out there in the first place. The whole thing should be a park." And Sheridan then responded, "Buddy, your exact reason that I'm making this." So the sheer lack of comprehension, indeed ignorance about people who own ranching and farming outfits out west and the people who actually operate, work them, was what kept Sheridan going. He shopped the idea to Paramount and they gave him the green light without asking him to make any major changes. Consequently, drawing on his own family background in ranching and horse breeding, Yellowstone is Sheridan's attempt to create a popular culture version and vision of the contemporary West that reflects more accurately, albeit dramatically, as in fictionally, its complexities. Onward to New West nostalgia. Seeing the way in which Yellowstone locates itself on the one hand within the genre's tradition and on the other at the intersection of living discourses and discourse lives, we propose that Sheridan's vision of the West is nostalgic in a new sense, not a fantasy of homecoming to an imagined place and time that never was, even though it was one, but rather a grittier creative exercise at homekeeping, that is pining for the present, or rather the co-presences that make up the complex life out west with ecological concerns, clashing capitalist agenda, the legacy of violent conquest and displacement of indigenous people, etc. So what we see at work in Yellowstone is not an evocation of a sense of a place through props and plots, but a longing in the form of action, a place-making endeavor. Wendell Berry argues in Standing by Words that action, quote, can only be understood in relation to place. Only by staying in place can the imagination conceive of or understand action in terms of consequence or cause and effect, end quote. Wallace Stegner echoes this connection, builds on Berry's belief that, quote, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are, end quote. To Stegner, the identity of a place is, quote, the kind of knowing that involves the senses, the memory, the history of a family or a tribe. The knowledge of a place comes from working in it in all weathers, making a living from it, suffering from its catastrophes, loving its mornings or evenings or hot noons, valuing it for the profound investment of labor and feeling that you, your parents and grandparents, your all but unknown ancestors have put into it. The knowing that poets specialize in, end quote. This is precisely the kind of knowing or placeness which we find in Yellowstone, making Sheridan into a 21st century televisual poet of the West. Yellowstone's West, seen in this new nostalgic, perhaps meta-nostalgic light, is not only a complex place, but a system of placed complexities, enmeshed in America's changing socioeconomic and cultural landscape. The show's emphasis on authenticity, its conscious departure from, as well as play with the classic genre's dichotomies, its attempts at desimplifying and demythologizing the West as a place and a people, we argue, all work towards engaging with the critical concerns and keeping them critical, making the present present rather than already riding off into the sunset.
And now to wrap things up, we'd like to share with you just a cursory mapping of those dimensions in the show where this new Western nostalgia manifests more or less explicitly. Harking back to the video clips that you saw at the beginning, this placeness of Yellowstone's nostalgia of homekeeping is always front and center whenever different stakeholders in the landed complexities of that fictional valley react to other stakeholders' schemes and machinations. As we're trying to make you see right at the beginning, the dynamics are anything but dichotomous. They're indeed intersectional, involving more than the Dutton clan's iron grip on their ranching empire facing off against the long game of someone like Thomas Rainwater and his goal to repatriate the land to his tribe. Whether it's small-scale real estate developers or investors, regional competitors in different sectors of the economy, or a multinational conglomerate eyeing the valley for large-scale tourism development, all these stakeholders' moves and counter-moves intersect. Sometimes they clash violently, sometimes they actually open up unexpected areas where their goals partially align. While these different stakeholders and the several trends in land use they represent have shaped the region for a considerable time, and those have also informed much of New West scholarship over the last 2 decades or so, Yellowstone is arguably among the few mass media artifacts that tries to remediate those New West complexities in a popular format. Reclamation policies, gentrification, and the rapid fragmentation of the land through subdivisions are thematized along with their attendant fears of Aspenization. This makes visible the socioeconomic and also classist fault lines of what Justin Farrell has recently identified as, quote, the charitable industrial complex with ever wealthier equity refugees extending their reach into otherwise still very rural environs. So John Dutton's domain then becomes the site where federal policies, though to a lesser degree, intersect with the contentious nexus of state and communal politics, ranging from wise use to local control movements.
Another dimension of the series' New West nostalgia pertains to semi-veiled claims to authenticity. Veiled unless you know the who's who in different sectors of livestock raising, roughstock sports, and horsemanship economies, respectively. We're well aware that authenticity is a loaded term, but there's hardly any other that describes what Sheridan tries to do. Verisimilitude in world building would be one, perhaps. In this context, the show's main focus lies on celebration of the skill and craft involved in cowboying, especially horsemanship. While Kevin Costner is known for knowing his way around horses, Yellowstone's ranch work verisimilitude is primarily channeled through recurring characters as well as increasingly high-profile guest appearances. For example, take the two characters of Lloyd and Jake, portrayed by Forrest J. Smith and Jake Reeves, respectively. Neither of them are professional actors, though they have worked in ancillary dimensions of film and TV productions, primarily stunt work and animal handling and training. Both are livestock raising professionals. Jake Reeves is a horse breeder and a horse trainer specializing in cutting horses. What is interesting is that while they started out as little more than extras, they have advanced to being fully credited, and their characters fulfill the role of the genuine ranch hand. When you follow them in the news and especially on social media when they're not shooting, you see that they're not only active but also actively sought after in the real world of livestock raising and horsemanship economies, from trade shows and rodeos to livestock auctions and ranching community events.
In a similar vein, Sheridan has increasingly populated the show with high-profile figures such as quarter horse performance trainer Bob Avila, whom the American Quarter Horse Association named their very first world's greatest horseman. Anyone who knows even a shred about the world of horse breeding and horse training knows that we're talking about big money. In the latest season, featured not only Bob, but also his current champion horse, Not My Day Job, aka Brutus. As we see another character on the show, newbie ranch hand Jimmy, make his forays into the world of bareback riding, the show also creates additional spaces of verisimilitude when members of the famous Steiner rodeo family, who has brought forth a number of national champions in different roughstock disciplines, make their appearances. And lastly, perhaps, there was a perceptible uptick of all these strategies to infuse verisimilitude into the show, following Sheridan's own foray into reality documentary television. Partially coinciding with the second season of Yellowstone, he produced The Last Cowboy, a 6-part show following 8 contenders during the 2019 Horse Reining Championship season. While not a rough-stock discipline in the national rodeo circuit, horse reining is a form of Western dressage riding that is often compared to figure skating, but simply on a horse. Why do we mention that at this point? I mean, Sheridan produced a crossover between those two shows where horse reining champions like Matt Mills or the McCutcheon family out of Texas visited the Dutton Ranch in the show. These are but the most obvious building blocks of this new Western nostalgia that we see at work here in Yellowstone. So in terms of a quick conclusion, I think it's safe to say that Yellowstone is not simply a 21st century version or a reboot of Dallas. We argue it's more like a televisual realist novel of homekeeping, owing its genealogy as much to Bonanza and Rawhide as to homesteading narratives in the vein of Willa Cather, Little House on the Prairie, or even Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. It is a story of land and people, fully conscious of its place and time, and aware of both the usefulness of being a story and the importance of being told. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're very much looking forward to receiving your questions at the end.
That was great. Thank you very much. Thanks to Stefan and to Pawel. Reece, can we hear you now is the big question.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Ah, excellent.
Excellent stuff. I'm glad to hear it. Let me just reset my timer here. We have got here Reece Goodall, who is going to talk to us about Toy Story. And over to you, Reece. All right, and I'll let you know in the chat how time is going.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologise about all the time issues at the speech issues at the start, but I hope this paper is worth it. And if you've seen a Pixar film, you'll know that it is a company which really thrives on nostalgia. As the Pixar archivist Josh Spiegel wrote, the company has perfected what he terms a nostalgia delivery system, which he argues evokes memories of a long-gone past, which are designed to resonate with an adult audience, as the cartoon characters and fun plots resonate with the children. However, despite the studio's play with genres and generic tropes in their films, you may think of sci-fi in WALL-E or the 50s spy film in The Incredibles, there's been little real discussion of how the audience familiarity with these genres is used to evoke nostalgia. And I think nowhere is the generic play more pronounced than in the Toy Story films. It draws on codes from genres as diverse as sci-fi, the horror film, the prison movie. And as our central character Woody is a cowboy toy, one of the most prominent generic influences is clearly that of the Western, a genre with a long history and long theorised as evoking and challenging certain nostalgic views of an American past. So what I want to do, I want to have a look at how the Western obviously suggests past in the genre. I want to consider how the Western is used as a tool in itself, how it explores nostalgia within its own generic boundaries. And then I want to have a closer look at the Toy Story 4 and see how it uses the character of Woody to challenge some of the fundamental tenets of the Western genre, and how, as a result, it encourages the viewer to critically engage with and explore their own nostalgic view of the past. Right, so although cowboys still exist nowadays, I think if anyone said the word cowboy to you, you'd probably imagine an America of long ago, or the Wild West, of open frontiers and the building of US civilization. And the iconography of the cowboy then is obviously used to suggest the past in the franchise through its mere presence. And you see on this slide, these are two stills from the first Toy Story, in which Andy transitions towards his new Buzz Lightyear. We see all the Western artifacts in his room fade away and be replaced with sci-fi. I think this is suggestive of the shift from Western films to sci-fi in America in the 1950s to 1960s, largely as a result of the space race. Similarly, you see here a shot from Toy Story 2. So in the film, Woody is taken by a toy collector who recognises him as part of a set of Western-themed toys, and thus extremely valuable due to his rarity. This image is a commercial of the initial set. You see it's clearly old, it's in black and white. The string puppets on Woody and Bullseye the horse feel very like an older toy. It again positions Woody as part of the past, and the whole setup of this film implies his connection to the past is intrinsic to his value. And importantly, Woody is the missing piece of a Western toy set, which includes other stock characters, the prospector, the horse, the cowgirl, which also links Woody's value to his generic status. Now, before I run into some of the more, before I analyse Woody's character, I want to touch briefly on the Western and its relationship with nostalgia. So it's been theorised by many as representing a certain American view of its national past, and a very nostalgic view in which society is governed by honour and justice, and pioneers seek to conquer the wilderness and instill civilization. As Barry Langford wrote, it is, quote, the vehicle used to explain itself to itself. And thus the classic Western prioritises the triumph of civilization against savagery, against disorder, against immorality. And on this slide, you see two prominent classic examples of the genre. There is Shane on the left and the original Magnificent Seven on the right. And this is a conception of Westerns which largely held true until about the 1970s and the emergence of so-called revisionist Westerns. These were different in that they questioned the idea of good and bad. They asked us to consider whether being violent was a positive test of character. I think the best example of this sort of film is Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, you see on the slide, which really showed us the stark reality of life in the West. Bernard Dort wrote that the Western was an inherently nostalgic genre because, quote, it exists only as a narrative of legends. And Unforgiven is a film which works to deconstruct these narratives, to question whether the legends of William Money, the famous bandit, or the Gene Hackman Sheriff Little Bob Daggett are really as positive and grand as they first seem. I show you these because you get here a sense of the Western as a genre which, at its heart, builds a nostalgic view of the past and then interrogates it. And where does Toy Story factor in? I think really we should break down the franchise into two halves. And so I've split it up like this, linking the character of Woody to the classical Western hero mould and the revisionist mould. And the first two films, made in 1995 and 1999, are concerned with Andy's early childhood. The second two, the third and fourth film, I should say, sorry, made in 2010 and 2019, and see Woody faced with the prospect of life after Andy, and which puts him in a space where he is forced to question his own sense of being. We learn in the fourth Toy Story film that Woody was made in the late 1950s. And therefore, I think initially we can understand him as a cowboy in the mold of the classical Western hero. He is a character who does what he does because he believes it to be the right course of action. And you can see this in the early films. He embodies a number of classical Western heroic tropes. He is loyal to his friends and he's protective of those in his care. So you see in the first one, for example, he is the leader of all of Andy's toys. He organises the house moving scheme and is very insistent that nobody gets left behind. He abides by his moral values. He attempts to do what is right, and he feels guilt for his failings. I'm going to show you these stills. I'm sorry, they're a bit dark. These are images from the climax of Toy Story 3, in which Lotso Bear, you can see here, he is trapped and he appeals to Woody to save him from a trash compactor. And Woody drops down, despite Lotso being the antagonist of the film, to help him, because it is the right thing to do. And tellingly, Lotso appeals to him as sheriff for help. And so we see Woody as a man of action, someone who runs into dangerous situations, someone who opts for compromise, and someone who seeks to fulfill his duty, which we see in these films is being Andy's favourite toy and bringing him happiness. And his role as a toy is influenced by his Western identity. He's not just a toy. Woody is a sheriff's toy. And so he's coded this way in the first two Toy Story films and for a large chunk of the third film. And that allows the end of the third and explicitly the fourth film to really pull Woody out of his comfort zone. It challenges his very conception of duty. And now he has a new owner who doesn't see him in the same way. He takes action in the fourth film to help his new owner, Bonnie, cope with preschool. He gives her the materials to make a new toy, Forky. And he's chastised by the other toys for doing this. And we see then he is no longer the leader of the group. He is consigned to Bonnie's closet with her nursery toys. Nursery toys, of course, being toys of a past. And he's stripped of his duty. He is gone from being the favourite toy to being nothing in the toy ecosystem. And he is unable to reconcile this. On this slide, you see here, these are images from the first Toy Story film. This is the opening sequence. Here, Andy's room has been transformed into a Western town. You see in the top left, a box has become a saloon. You see a hold-up situation in the bottom left. And you see Woody against the clouds in an image that could easily have come from a classical Western film, as our hero rides off into the distance. And I show you these to stress the point that Woody conforming to his sheriff's role and Woody being a plaything are intrinsically linked right from the word go in Toy Story. Here you see, this is the opening sequence from Toy Story 3. Set, again, this is a classic Western scape, trains, riding horses, cow schools, open deserts. This is an imagined Western adventure. We see Woody ride to save a train from Mr. Potato Head. And before we cut to a montage which leads us through Andy growing up and into the modern day. This song, You've Got a Friend in Me, plays against this montage. And as Randy Newman sings, The Years Will Never Die, the soundtrack distorts. This is showing a nostalgic, fun past fading into a gloomy present. I show you these two sequences for two reasons. So you see the generic status of Western adventures is porous. How we imagine this past is a porous one. So this looks like a classical Western setup, but later on, Woody is confronted with force-field dogs. He's confronted with sports cars, spaceships. And these non-Western adventures filter into these imagined Western landscapes, which implies a somewhat playful nature to the past. And our nostalgia for a particular time is subject to reimagination, to reinterpretation. It does not have a fixed status in itself. And this is the scene that comes immediately after this scene in Toy Story 3. And this is set in the present day. You see in the background of the scene is Andy's toy box, which looks like a Western wagon side. you can see here. And this, in the present day, becomes a prison of sorts for the toys. It's somewhere in which they long to be played with, but which Andy rarely ever goes. And so they are kept in place by their nostalgic view of being played with again. The toy box then is a site of nostalgia, but it's also a site of imprisonment for the toys. By being trapped in that nostalgia box, they are unable to move forward. Woody, as a sheriff character, he is moved by questions of duty to his child and to order. And questions of duty feature quite heavily in the fourth Toy Story film. This is the film that really challenges Woody's role. So he's no longer the favourite toy. And so he decides instead to prevent Forky, who has become the new favourite toy, from throwing himself away. He re-encounters his friend Bo Peep in the adventure, and she asks him why he is driven to do this. What is his motivation? He sadly tells her that, quote, "It's all I have left to do. I don't have anything left," end quote. And so this is the sheriff as a favourite toy no more. He doesn't control the toy ecosystem. He has no duty now that his kid has forgotten him. But yet his attempts to forge a new role are still governed by his nostalgic view of what the favourite toy should be, by his previous duty to his kid. You saw the opening of the first Toy Story, which connected this Western adventure to providing happiness to a child. But it's no longer an option for Woody in the fourth Toy Story. He is now without a frontier. He is stuck in the past, a nostalgic view of the past from which he is unable to break away. And it's a view of the past that he mentions nostalgically throughout the fourth film. As he describes to Forky how wonderful it is to be a toy, he keeps talking about Bonnie, but using the word Andy. Woody is unable to break out of his nostalgia. And so Woody has escaped, he has retrieved and escaped Forky, and the two are walking to the family RV. But Woody is distracted. This is the image on the slide now. He sees Bo Peep's lamp in an antique shop window. This lamp is a figment of his past with Andy. And so he breaks into the shop to investigate. Forky then winds up trapped. He becomes a prisoner of Woody's attempts to literally revisit his past. And I think the idea of an antique shop here is really significant because it indicates the value of and the attraction of nostalgia and nostalgic artifacts. In the centre of this shop, there is a display cabinet, which becomes a prison, the prison in which Forky is enclosed. And it again implies to me the potentially confining nature of the past. And as a result, Woody's attempts to do his self-imposed duty, by returning Forky to Bonnie, are sidetracked and conflicting with his own ideas for happiness. In this way, much of Toy Story 4's narrative is centred around Woody coming to terms with the fact that his idealised past is now in the past. He can only achieve happiness by transcending the generic boundaries and his role as a kid's toy. He tells Buzz Lightyear, when their family are in the RV, that he didn't remember it being this hard, dealing with Andy as a young child. I'm sure if you've seen Toy Story 1 and 2 and the adventures on which the toys go, you can see that it wasn't particularly easy either. But it speaks to the nostalgia at the heart of Woody's character. So he, continuing in this vein, he runs into action as the sheriff does in this fourth film. But in this case, he makes things worse. He alienates many of the other toys, and he can't exactly understand what his role is meant to be. This is the sentiment that the film's ostensible villain, Gabby Gabby, plays on. She is a doll without a voice box, and she asks Woody to surrender his. And for him, again, it's a generic marker because it's loaded with Western stock phrases like, "There's a snake in my boot," and "Someone's poisoned the water hole." And for her, this is a chance to be a toy instead of an antique. And Woody does this, and Gabby goes to a child she hopes will take care of her and is rejected. And so Woody needs to coax her out of the shop, telling her that lots of children will love her. She's worried, and he tells her, quote, "If you sit on a shelf the rest of your life, you'll never find out." I think this is really important. Woody acknowledges the value of his nostalgia as a means of motivating Gabby to move forward, to help her find a new kid. But for him, getting off the shelf also means embracing the existentially terrifying moment of moving away from his own past, from passing out from this classical view he has of a happy life to something new. He once belonged to a kid, but that kid is Andy, and this is Woody realizing he must move on. And so in encouraging Gabby to leave this shop, a place dedicated to the past, in order to move into the future, this gesture is laden with symbolism. So I mentioned the classical Western thrives on a simple duality: civilization is good, wilderness is bad. I think of the stereotype of, the savage Indian that filled in many of these 1950s Westerns. You've got the idea there. In the Toy Story films, there's a certain version of this dynamic based around the role of a toy, which is outright said in this shot from the first Toy Story. It is good to be a kid's toy. The alternative, as Woody is shouting in anguish here, is to be lost. I think that word lost evokes the very sense of the outside, of the wilderness. And Toy Story 4, for the first time, shows Woody the attraction of the wilderness. So when he encounters Bo Peep, he sees her happiness as a lost toy, and that tests his own ideas about his role in life. The sheriff's place in the toy ecosystem, which is sort of a stand-in for civilization, has elapsed, and so the allure of the wilderness proves powerful. And for Woody, attempting to hold on to the past is stifling him. He's a sheriff without a town, and he's stuck trying to protect an order that does not exist. And it's through shattering this binary of civilization good, wilderness bad, that he's able to move forward. On this slide, you see these are images from the end of Toy Story 4. So what I've said is that in the film, Woody's internal conflict stems from his confines within a generic framework. As a sheriff toy, he attempts to abide by these conventions, even as his nostalgic past has gone. And it's only through freeing himself he can move forward. So in this scene, Woody gives his sheriff badge to Jessie, a gesture indicating he's moving on from his responsibilities as a toy. And it highlights the clear link between his two identities, that as a sheriff and that of the kid's plaything. He shatters the classical idea that only civilization and finding your role within society can bring happiness and fulfillment. He moves beyond his confining role. That he does this to a sweeping part of Randy Newman's score, with lavish strings, undeniable Western undertones, which I think evokes for me the music of Aaron Copland. It suggests the adventurousness and triumph of a Western hero, but it's a triumph achieved in this case through transcending nostalgic and generic boundaries that for so long defined him. And so I'll leave you with this thought. The climax of Toy Story 4 allows us to understand the dual function of nostalgia. It is something that builds our characters, which functions as a place of security and happiness. But it's also something that we should interrogate and from which we can and should grow. In the fourth film, Woody realizes that holding on to this nostalgic view of his past has led to him becoming isolated, lonely, and unhappy. And it's through moving forward from transcending genre boundaries that he finds himself. To quote Randy Newman's closing song, he was a lonesome cowboy, but not anymore. That's the end of my paper. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Reece. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next speaker, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. Have we got Izzy?
Oh, yeah.
Hello. Okay, so we'll just reset the clock here. So Isabella Macleod is a recent postgraduate from King's College London, where she completed her dissertation on motherhood and absence in Cleo Bernard's feature films. She is currently working on a PhD application regarding the Outback's place in modern Australian cinema, although I believe that has been successful, and you are now a PhD student, right?
Yes, University of Queensland now in 2021.
Massive congratulations.
Thank you.
And on that note, you're going to be talking to us about Australian Westerns, and I will leave you to it. All right.
Yeah.
And I'll let you know in the chat about the passage of time. All right.
Sure, perfect. All right. Can everyone, we'll see that okay, I assume. So, so as a lot of other people in this conference have already discovered, 20 minutes is a short amount of time to talk about something. So you may see things on this PowerPoint that I can't go into great detail on, but I'm basically going to establish sort of the place of nostalgia in the Australian Western, and then how two films, Sweet Country and The Nightingale, go about sort of flipping it into a form of anti-nostalgia instead. So To be nostalgic for something, whether a period of time, an event, a way of being, suggests a sense of both distance and loss. That which we are nostalgic for is long past, but cannot be recovered in a meaningful way. When nostalgia is invoked by a film, the audience can safely experience an enclosed past, and whether positive or negative, can yearn for all it shows with the understanding it cannot exist in their present moment. And when the film deals with national identity in all its sort of more difficult aspects, so histories of colonialism, oppression, war, they appear to have little impact on the present moment, and they're confined within a nostalgic construction of the past. Genre tropes have proven useful in giving shape to both nostalgic and national narratives, interlinked as they are. And in the case of the Western, is a period setting that encloses nostalgia it evokes. Not coincidentally, is a period setting inevitably tangled up with the invasion of settlers across a frontier space, a history that settler colonies must wrangle with if they intend to cover the contradictions and failures in their formation. So despite Andrew Bazin's assertion that the Western is American cinema par excellence, multiple scholars have since expanded the genre to be understood as a series of tropes more readily associated with the effects of colonialism around the world. One such variation, or rather concurrent development, is the Australian Western. So many conventions of the Western find an easy home in the Australian outback, including the entanglement of frontier landscapes and the construction of a national identity. The repetitious nature of the narratives of the genre tells of early settlers establishing the land as their own and bringing a colonial form of justice. And it's better understood then as a settler-colonial mode of cinema. So when Steve Neal lays out the unique national characteristics of frontier experience on screen in the US Western, he lays them out as marked by opportunity and danger, hardship and bounty, and adventure and violence. So they can be understood more as general features required to construct a national identity using those tropes rather than sort of specific to the US landscape. Certainly there's little doubt among scholars that images of early frontier living have permeated the Australian consciousness. Glenn Lewis notes that the celebration of the outlaw or underdog is common to national identity, while Grayson Cook identifies early bushranger films, which told mostly true stories of outlaws, as an important precursor to the Australian Western. When safely contained in the past, such stories bolster the notion of a national identity based around an intrinsic morality that functions at a higher level than the unjust law at the time. While at the same time, the present-day form of law and order in the colony is understood as separate from the frontier form, and so more just than what came before it. Nostalgia has a dual function then within the genre. It ignites a nationalistic pride in the success of early settlement, while also condemning more troubling elements of the frontier past, and so divorces them from the settler colony as it functions in the present moment. To turn this nationalistic nostalgia back on itself is not an easy process. As Tom O'Regan noted, Australian cinema has an uncanny ability to take distant voices and subsume them too into the canon of national cinema. Yet two recent entries into the Australian Western canon do attempt to destabilise the dominant viewpoint of the genre, that of the white male outlaw who rides across the vast expanse of the outback with the trappings of settler society close behind him. The first is Sweet Country, directed by Warwick Thornton. Set post-World War I and on the surface carrying the iconography of a traditional Western, the story pivots its viewpoint to an Aboriginal man, Sam Kelly, who kills a white man, war veteran Harry March, in self-defence after suffering various acts of injustice, including Harry's rape of his wife, Lizzie, and is forced to flee from authorities. The second is The Nightingale. Directed by Jennifer Kent, it follows Irish convict Claire's pursuit of justice alongside the tracker Billy through the 1920s Tasmanian wilderness against soldiers who killed her family and raped her. Despite their differences, both films share a deconstructionist approach to the Australian Western. They invoke an immediate realism with their diegetic-only soundscapes and unflinching portrayals of colonial violence in all forms, and yet both tell a classic Australian story of an outlaw forced to seek their own form of justice. In doing so, they expose the ways the Australian Western is entangled with the aesthetics of nostalgia and nationality, and reformat them in ways that close the distance between the audience and the past. This creates what I argue is a form of anti-nostalgia, uncomfortably close where the nostalgic films are distant, and interconnected with modern issues where the Western often creates an enclosed narrative with a clear ending. sorry about the density of this slide. Distance is an important aspect of the Australian Western, in both the landscape and between the films and the audience. For Elizabeth Povinelli, the nostalgia over the distant past is a defining element of Australian national identity. Both positive and negative elements of the settler-colonial's early years are self-contained within the genre's limits and allow a national sense of mourning that, quote, propels the nation into a new cleansed national form, end quote. One can only mourn what has come to an end, and so the colonial trauma is relegated to that self-enclosed form where the nostalgic genre of which the nostalgic genre of the Western represents. Opening up the past as a continuous rather than enclosed form is the first part of creating an anti-nostalgic experience. It is here that we can use Patrick Wolf's formulations of the structural dimension of invasion. Quote, these structures are not inert. They are constituted through events, through practices that colonizers repeatedly strive to maintain, in various shifting adaptations to native stubborn exteriority. Rather than the settler expansion being a series of self-contained events, they are a singular, constantly shifting structure, undertaking multiple guises to allow those in charge to safely deny each one when it no longer suits their national image. Such an approach to the past pivots the Western from being understood as primarily temporal to primarily spatial, with an impact that expands beyond its period setting. And in both Sweet Country and The Nightingale, space is a self-conscious creation. For Sweet Country, the landscape is, on its surface, typical of the genre. Adopting a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio, the cinematography in places mimics the broad sweeping shots of the Western, such as when the troop pursuing Sam and his wife Lizzie cut across the bush, rock formations towering behind them as they move across the screen. It is an aesthetic that Peter Limbrick identifies as carrying distinct spatial modes, creating a dichotomy between empty landscape and settled farms. But where typical settlement offers safety from the dangers of the outback, within Sweet Country it is shown as a restrictive place, with the camera often peering out of the windows and doorways at its characters. It is only when Sam is forced to flee with Lizzie after he kills Harry that the landscape opens up to them, marked by a tracking shot that follows the pair, leaving behind the markers of settler society the station they work on represents. Yet Fortin is careful not to fall into a nostalgic notion of one nation, united from early settlement. Multiple Aboriginal characters speak about their idea of country and its fragmented nature. As Archie, a temporary tracker, tells Sergeant Fletcher, who leads the search for Sam, when they reach the edges of a dried riverbed, white salt and sand stretching out into a wavering horizon, "That's not my country." And what country, or countries we do see, are fragmented by temporal ruptures which upset the notion of the Western as a self-contained story. These ruptures reveal an interiority to the character, reveal the interior nature of the characters, according to Fortin, who states, "If you want to get inside characters' minds, we don't just think backwards of our fears, we think forwards of our dreams." Sweet Country disrupts its linear narrative promised by the iconography of the genre, and instead provides an experience of space and the collective imaginary, foregrounding the undercurrents always present in the national consciousness, but previously held at bay by the limits of the Western narrative. The Nightingale, despite its revenge narrative fitting the Western genre, veers more sharply away from the same iconography. With its 4:3 aspect ratio, damp and dark Tasmanian setting, and intense acts of violence, it stands apart from Sweet Country in some ways. Yet it still portrays an untamed frontier, and with its 1820 setting, a more accurate one than a sun-blasted interior. By enclosing the very frame itself, and focusing on close-ups of various characters rather than the land around them, Kent denies the audience a nostalgic pleasure in seeing the beauty of the landscape, entwined as it is with the national identity. Instead, when the landscape is shown in its full expanse, it is a condemnation. The soldier's trackers, Charlie, takes them high into the mountains and presents Tasmania in all its wild beauty as the land they wanted. The irony is, the soldiers seek civilization. The country they want is not what already exists, but what they can make of it. The nostalgic vision of an untouched land is rejected within the narrative by the very characters who should usually be marvelling at its beauty. The majority of the time, however, the 4:3 aspect ratio emphasises close-ups of the characters. The violence too within the film is not distant scenes of a standoff at dawn or sweeping shots of men on horses rushing into war, for intimate acts of cruelty. Foremost in these acts is the multiple rapes committed by the soldiers who traverse Tasmania with Claire and Billy in pursuit. Sexual violence is something of an unsaid element to the Western. Wives and daughters are brutalised by the villain to give hero a reason for his own violence in return, but usually off-screen. In The Nightingale, there is no landscape to cast our gaze to instead, only the expressions of the characters, mostly Claire and Billy, in the face of the various injustices committed against them. It is the both of them who make up the legacy of the settler colony in the absence of the genre framework the landscape usually provides. With both films destabilising the spatial aesthetic of the genre, the question of what this function this new viewpoint has opens up. Despite the proliferation of revisionist Australian westerns in the 21st century, my second slide's covering a lot of them, the majority still favour a white male protagonist. Sweet Country defies this notion in a self-conscious manner from its opening scenes. After the flash forward of Sam's trial, the film follows Harry March riding up to the station in a manner that invokes other iconography of the outlaw transversing the outback. Meanwhile, our true protagonist, Sam, remains in the background of the scene as Harry dismounts and speaks to the station owner, Pastor Fred Smith. We learn through interspersed flashbacks and flash forwards that Harry is an alcoholic due to possible PTSD. Factors that would in any other Australian Western inform him as a troubled protagonist who holds both the negative and positive traits of the colonial frontier. But it is not Harry who is our protagonist, and his flaws earn him his death instead. Often, revisionist Westerns believe the best way to confront more problematic elements is to unfold them into the protagonist's condition, but fail to realise how this does little to destabilise the already dominant viewpoint. Tad Gallagher inadvertently highlights this issue in his identification of three main elements of the revisionist Western. Foremost in his final point, that of the genre becoming less simple, tidy and naive, more ambiguously complex and ironic, more self-critical and into the art of telling. The questions raised by this summary are immediate. What self and telling on who? Sweet Country is not self-critical when it follows Harry's storming of Fred's station from only the view of the Aboriginal characters present. Gallagher assumes a white viewpoint even in the revisionist form, and so limits the genre to its nostalgic roots. Morally grey settlers offer little resolution to the Indigenous people they cross paths with. This pivot from self-critical identification to full condemnation is clear in The Nightingale too. The echoes of later colonialism within the film recalls Povinelli's conclusions that there is no mythical past Australia untouched by the destruction of invasion. Billy was taken away from his family, invoking a yet-to-come history of settlers stealing away Aboriginal children. And throughout the film, Aboriginal people are seen hanged in chains, raped and murdered, facing more violence than even Claire does in the beginning. Jourdain Sells identifies this in establishing the individual acts of violence the soldiers and other white men commit in the film as part of a systematic enactment of colonialism. By centering a viewpoint that follows after the soldiers' destruction and experiences it firsthand as well, there is no mediation between adventure and violence or opportunity and danger, only a frank and inescapable depiction of the various ways frontier violence is committed, and so paves the way for the settler state to establish itself and deny all that came before. Claire's inability to replicate that violence and her revulsion the one time she does also reframes the Western ideal of the protagonist who can deal out morally right violence. All violence becomes colonial violence in the frontier, and so cannot be understood as free from those complex and often unjust moral codes. As established, a unique element to Australian Western is its troubled relationship with the law. There is a divide created from early bushranger films between the newly formed post-frontier order and those who still operate by their own moral code. Sorry, I'll skip a bit for time. So Sweet Country considers the place of these two seemingly opposed forces in the trial that ends the film. After discovering that his wife is pregnant via Harry, Sam returns to the town. Soon after, a judge arrives from a large town. He refuses to hold court in the bar, the only communal building in the town, and so they construct a court out of what is left of the outdoor cinema from the night before. By juxtaposing these two events, Thornton identifies the importance of both as a form of national unity, despite one preaching lawlessness and the other lawfulness. It is a viewpoint that goes on to condemn both sides, as the town cheers on the outlaws on the screen, but goes on to jeer the one before them in real life. The inseparability of these two conflicting elements of national identity is expanded on by Woolf as necessary to colonial expansion, as while one hand enacts the violence of so-called irregular activities, the other condemns it. Usually the enclosed narrative of the Western does the work of stitching these two forms into a balanced ending. The outcome of the trial in Sweet Country reveals the conflict as a fundamental flaw within the settler colony. The judge finds Sam not guilty of murder, absolving him in the eyes of the colonial state, which acts as a stand-in for the audience who's had their knowledge of Sam's innocence validated. Other injustices can be safely mourned, knowing justice prevailed. Then, on the way out of town, Sam is shot and killed by an unknown sniper. With his death, the promise of justice the Western typically offers is taken away from the audience. They are forced to the realization that the absolution of Sam's actions bears little consequence when the enactors of colonial violence remain lingering out of frame. That this disruption occurs in the closing moment also ruptures the enclosed ending that usually finishes the Western. The Nightingale operates similarly in its final act. When Claire and Billy finally make it to town, they find little in terms of state justice. Within the narrative of the film, both state and lawlessness are less two entities working in tandem, but a singular structure represented by the Imperial British forces. So Billy's Indigenous justice comes up to meet it, to avenge both his and Claire's families. Again, though, the startling and abrupt nature of the violence serves more as a reflection of the colonial violence present throughout the film, highlighting its inescapable nature as a structure rather than a series of isolated events. And like Sam, Billy receives no absolution from following the archetype of the outlaw seeking vengeance. He is fatally wounded while Claire survives, and as they both watch the sunrise on the beach, he performs a traditional dance. The significance of this choice lies not in the dance itself, which could easily become part of that pure tradition Povinelli believed Australia is always striving for, but the fact that Billy is undeniably marked by colonial violence through a gunshot wound in his stomach. Rather than attributing his heritage with a nostalgic distance, Kent brings it into immediate closeness of all he has suffered, invoking Povinelli's assertion that, quote, to be Indigenous requires passing through and in the passage being scarred by the geography of the state, end quote. Thornton also expands on this idea of crossing over colonial violence with the Western and the way it brings people into closeness with this form of scarring. As he states, my aim has been to use the accessibility of the Western genre for audiences to enter the story and be drawn into this world and so experience the issues faced by an occupied people. This demand is made clear by the final words of Sweet Country, asking, what chance have we got? What chance has this country got? In the first line, only the characters within the film are invoked, but with the second, all the nation is drawn to the same question. Presenting no answer, the spatial bounds of the film open up towards a more immediate present. Pessimism of both films' endings can then be understood as a refusal to end the narrative in a conclusive way, understanding that the injustices they portray have yet to come to an end either. I will come to a quick conclusion here. In my title, I spoke of an oxymoron, and though I've not used the word before now, I hope the spirit of the term is clear in how Sweet Country and The Nightingale use an iconography onto which much of Australian national identity forms itself and then reveals its limits, its contradictions, and its failures. The figure of the outlaw is one bolstered by a colonial apparatus, and when the outlaw becomes, and when the outlaw becomes a marginalised figure, the apparatus that they once had now is a lack. The conflict between justice and order then become clear. To look back on these narratives without addressing that singular conflict of who benefits from these portrayals of colonial violence on the frontier is irresponsible. To be anti-nostalgic is to understand these events are more than enclosed narratives to be celebrated or mourned. They are the structures the current settler colony is built upon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank all of our speakers. Thank you to all of our speakers for some excellent papers. So we'll move on to questions then. As I say, I'm not very good at noticing when people are putting hands up or doing thumbs up. So if you want to ask a question, if you want to ask it on video and you want to actually kind of ask it yourself, just say, I've got a question and I'll pass over to you. So please do put any questions down in the chat, or if you want to ask it yourself, just tell me you've got a question down there. For now, I've had one just come in. So this one is for Reece and it's from Tom Watson. So I was wondering exactly where issues of nostalgia in relation to Toy Story are most resonant. In 1995, a sheriff doll for a young boy, presumably around 6 years old, and therefore born in around 1989, would still be considered fairly archaic. Are parents the audience being targeted here? Or are there wider concerns about an aging youth audience that has grown up with these films since the mid-1990s and possibly now have children of their own? So that's for Reece.
I think that especially in the first Toy Story, I think this idea of the idea of using a cowboy is to appeal to that older audience. I mentioned the Josh Spiegel article. He looks at this a bit more. He says that although adults would have rushed home when they were young and had that dilemma between choosing Woody or Buzz, he imagined that he is of that age, and he said he had that nostalgic reaction when he watched the film in the first time, of moving from his cowboy toys to his spaceman toys. And so I think certainly in the first couple of films, I think it is more targeted towards parents and an older audience. I think I agree with you that for a 6-year-old, the cowboy is not that laden with meaning.
Okay. Have we got any more questions that anybody would like to ask? Stephen Morgan, yeah, if you want to just come on and ask your question, yeah.
Hi, Craig. Thanks for that. It's a question. I don't know if it's a question for Izzy, actually. Hi, Izzy. I know we've kind of talked about these films a little bit before, but I'm quite interested in this kind of thing you were talking about revisionism as a form of nostalgia, which I think is a really interesting kind of idea. And I'm wondering whether, God, I've lost my train of thought now. But I'm wondering whether how you feel that kind of, I guess I wanted to link that to this point that you made about, I think it was a quote from Reagan about the ability to subsume distinct voices from elsewhere. And I'm wondering, because one of the things that I think is really interesting about Indigenous cinema in Australia is this problem of, if they are in some ways a reaction to the settler-colonial state, what happens when they actually become subsumed within Australian culture? So one of the big tensions, obviously, in Indigenous Australia at the moment is this idea of, do we want to be kind of ingrained in that central thing of this, what is essentially an illegal occupation, or do we want a whole complete separate thing? And I think it's one thing that Indigenous cinema really needs to grapple with, and I just wonder whether you had any thoughts on that.
You're muted, Izzy.
Yeah. Zoom very helpfully told me. Yeah, so I think it's definitely interesting. I think it's definitely one of the biggest to and fro's. I think for a lot of national cinema is an issue of I think Australian cinema is very good at it, but I think a lot of national cinemas are very good at just taking anything that goes, oh, we're against the mainstream, and go, you're part of our mainstream now. But I think particularly with Indigenous cinema, so I mentioned Pawel a few times. I've had to delete a lot from this conference, sort of talking about, where she talks about the idea of mourning. So the idea is, for a lot of if we're looking at Indigenous culture in period films, there's this sense of, oh, this is past and this has gone away now. And I think that is an issue. I think Thornton's very aware of it. I think Samson and Delilah is a really good example of that idea of how Australian culture loves Indigenous culture, except in the current moment where it does all it can to reject it. So I think for Thornton approaching a Western, he's definitely trying to draw people in. I think at the end, having your main Indigenous character, who the audience has probably gone, no, he's innocent, it's all good. So he's, we've seen him be, basically the state's gone, no, you're okay. And for him to turn around and say, no, as long as there's people that still are against that, it's going to overwhelm any sort of liberal voices. As much as I think I mentioned where Wolf pretty much sums it up as, on the one hand, you've got these irregular activities, like the killing of Sam Kelly, but then the state goes, oh, but we said it's okay. And then they actually work in tandem. They're not against each other. It's how they function together. So I hope that sort of answers it. I think it's a really big question. Hence, this is probably my PhD.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, I guess this question of, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but this question of pastness and the problematic nature of, it's more acceptable for a white audience if it's set in the past. I think, as you pointed out with Samson and Delilah, a little bit trickier. But yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we have a question from Martha Shearer.
Hi, my question is for Pawel and Steve. I love that paper. I haven't seen Yellowstone at all, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but you've absolutely convinced me that I need to watch it. So I'm just wondering to what extent the show's interest in sort of land speculation and real estate that you were setting out, and its nostalgia, to what extent it makes sense to situate that in relation to the global financial crisis, and especially given that Sheridan's Hell or High Water has been absolutely read in that light, right?
Pawel, you want to take it?
Take it, Steve.
What was that?
Take it.
Okay, I'll take it. Well, essentially, yes. I mean, it's there in the background. In particularly, we do have all these. What Justin Farrell, for instance, I can only wholeheartedly recommend this book. Came out last year, I think, Princeton University Press. Which talks a lot about those equity refugees, where basically, those people who were not hit by the financial crisis, and we're talking really about the uber wealthy. So we're talking about the top 0.1%, turn once again toward the West and turn it into some sort of playground. So that's very much, that dynamic is very much there. Perhaps not so much in the first two seasons. I think they really, Pawel, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you read that somewhat differently, it's sort of like this fairly procedural one-by-one addition to or adding of more and more bigger players, players with more resources. And particularly now in the third season, we do have a multinational conglomerate. And we thought we already had seen, big money pouring in the first season, where we have land speculation and all that. But there's always a bigger fish, right? So you do have that. And that's kind of same thing he packages into Hell and High Water, for instance. You'll find that actually spread out a lot, and a lot more over the course of 3 seasons so far.
From season to season, it seems that there's sort of a higher stakes, and the scope also grows. But you can already see it in the first season that the big money is there, and you cannot really escape thinking about who the big, so this sort of opposition of the biggest landowner and the really big money, the really bigger fish that comes to just swallow it and turn it into a park, hotels, airport, or whatever. Stop spoiling now.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Liam Bull. So Liam.
Hiya. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got one for Izzy. I was just wondering how I thought it was great. There was loads of things about the Nightingale that I hadn't necessarily thought of, especially with the idea, because I was quite disappointed by Billy, being sort of struck down by the film at the end, when it's ostensibly doing so much to sort of raise up Indigenous voices and this, that, and the other. But the idea of placing the ending of the film within the sort of like looking to the future and that sort of thing was really fascinating. But on that as well, I was just wondering how you'd place the proposition within this sort of this sort of enclosed or not enclosed, anti-nostalgic, or nostalgic, of course, sort of tradition, because it's quite similar to the Nightingale in a lot of ways, but also massively different. So I just wondered if you care to offer your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the proposition is definitely a more interesting one, because it does a lot of the thing. It's revisionist in a way that's quite so Sweet Country and Nightingale's very diegetic realism approach, even if they fragment it with sort of dream sequences. While the proposition, you're looking at that sort of the soundtrack is so important to it and things like that. But I think it's one of those things that sort of got lost in the current floor as well. But basically, with the proposition, there's this sort of the outlaw and the outsider, the underdog. You've got the Irish sort of ex-convicts / children of convicts / immigrants, alongside the Aboriginal characters as two sort of both underneath the British type characters. So a lot of, I think in that film, a lot of the revisionist elements are actually much more of creating an independent Australian identity divorced from a British one, where I think Sweet Country and the Nightingale say, there's the scene, it's funny because Nightingale is a film I didn't like on the first time round, and then the second time around, I was much more appreciative of what Kent's trying to wrangle with. I, again, don't know how successful it is. I had a bit about, like, Aboriginal women in both films, I think, don't get enough of the, like, screen time than they should as, like, significant characters. But I think Nightingale and Sweet Country deal a lot more with the idea of people that don't want to be a part of that one nation that Australia was clearly trying to make. Both Billy and Claire refuse it in different ways. And I think when you watch it the second time around, even with the understanding Claire will probably go on to be descendants of people who consider themselves fully Australian, she is very divorced. When she meets other Australians or other, you know, people who've moved to Australia, she's very much different to them, and you get that sense in it. So I think I've gone a bit off track from your question, but I think in the proposition, the proposition is very much about creating an Australian identity out of fragmented identities, where I think Sweet Country and Nightingale says, no, there is no Australian identity, which is much more interesting.
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought of that actually, about the sort of consolidation of all the characters in the proposition, but that's great. Yeah.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? I've got one for Reece, and if we've got time, I've got one for Stefan and Pawel as well, but we'll see where we go. So Reece, one thing that struck me during your paper, have you thought about the workings of nostalgia in Toy Story 2? Because it kind of strikes me that that film already starts to break down the myth of the West through the character of Stinky Pete, who has an inherently hilarious name, but is also just kind of representative of everything that was wrong with the Old West, you know? And also maybe through the collector, who's got that kind of toxic nostalgia going on of toy collecting and making sure they're in pristine condition and so on and so forth. So I wondered if you'd thought about that.
I think it's interesting with Stinky Pete, and I mentioned in the paper about Woody's two ideas, and that his identity was conferred by both his generic status and the fact that he is a toy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've seen the film, if you haven't seen the film, I should say, and Stinky Pete's motivation is he wants to be in a museum. He wants to be kept behind glass forever. And this is what brings him in conflict with Woody in the end. And so I agree with you then that he is in many ways sort of the antithesis to Woody's character.
Mm-hmm.
And he is I think, especially the second film is very nostalgic. And if you've seen, there's a sort of a painful sequence in which the character of Jessie shares her nostalgia for her last owner. Painful, very tear-jerking as well, if you haven't seen. And so each of these characters is, I think, really nostalgic in a different way in the second film. And Jessie's narrative kind of is similar to the one that Woody undergoes in the fourth film. Pete has gone past being a toy. He wants to be an artifact and nothing more. And the way we imagine, I'd say that the way I would imagine a prospector is someone, you know, striking for fortune and someone who wants to enrich those around him. And this is not what he wants to do for the other three members of the Western toy set. You will. And so in the film,
let's not forget Bullseye. Don't forget.
Oh, Bullseye, of course, Bullseye. So if you haven't seen the film, Pete turns out to be a surprise villain. We don't realise he is the bad guy until a bit later on in the film. And I think perhaps for an older audience as well, having a certain nostalgic idea of what each of these roles would be in a Western setting can make that a more surprising development.
Okay.
I'm not going to run on too much longer. I'll give the other guys a chance to...
Okay, so I have got one last question for Stefan and Pawel. Kevin Costner is my question, basically. He comes with a lot of baggage, and I wondered how his kind of star persona plays into that show's kind of mediation of the West.
Pawel, I'll let you go first.
Well, I'll have to ask, which baggage do you mean? What do you mean by baggage here? There's a lot of it, but...
Well, the fact that he comes with this idea of the kind of perhaps classic Western hero in some ways, I suppose that in the 90s we're thinking of more revisionist stuff, but people think of Kevin Costner, they think of the Old West, you know.
You're thinking dances, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. don't think that this probably part of the reason why he was selected for the role is that baggage, as we refer to it. He's definitely a kind of character in that show which sort of engages with that past, and he is definitely one of the strengths of that sort of new nostalgic mode, but not to the extent that everything else that we mentioned that adds to the authenticity is there. So probably he was added as a star originally, but he does pull his weight, really, right? And of course, he does a lot of things. He uses a lot of his well, let's put it this way, acting repertoire that he used in other movies than Western movies. In his career. So he is sort of, he plays the type against the type. That's what I would, that's how I'd put it in that. But I'm sure Steve can add something here as well.
Well, just to piggyback perhaps something, I mean, if you look at Kevin Costner's engagement with the Western over the years, and particularly, in 2019, the National Cowboy Hall of Fame inducted him. And it's particularly interesting what he said during his acceptance speech, but he has also kind of progressed working in the form, in the genre, right? I mean, if you compare, let's say, dances with, I don't know, open range, there's quite a bit of a perceptible change there. And I think it becomes even more interesting if you set that against the changing tides of what you find in New Western scholarship in particular. So the various trends that New Western scholars and critics actually look at, not just in the generic sense, but also historians, ethnographers, and all that. And I think with Costner now, and also particularly the role he plays on Yellowstone, we just see that progression take yet another step. Actually, and this is, I think, also where what Pawel said earlier, I think this is what he brings to the show, and that's why Taylor Sheridan picked him ultimately, is that he is also personally kind of at least partially entangled with horsemanship economies in particular. So there is, and it's not so much about authenticity and verisimilitude, where I'm thinking now, it's more about really just showing that kind of complexity. So it's not because we ourselves bring so many very simplistic, highly mediated and distorted associations to the West, right? Also the contemporary West. Mm-hmm. But, once you get a chance to go there and spend a little bit more time there, and actually, get a chance also to actually work with people who live that life, things begin to look a lot different. And I think that's something that they try to do by way of Costner, among others.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we are. Sorry, I'm gonna call it a day, because we're at exactly 25 past 3. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Pawel, Stefan, Izzy, and Reece. Thank you very much for excellent papers, and I'm sure that we'll see you on the Discord channel. Thanks very much, folks. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.